Hello, everyone. As you just heard, we have hit 1 o'clock and we are ready to get started. I wanted to thank you personally for attending this webinar. It is a real honor to have Kivi Leroux here talking with us today. Great communication practices are really important. Some of you who got a mixed up email from me with the wrong salutation can attest to how important good communication is. So I'm really excited to talk about nonprofit communications and what that looks like this year for us. My name is Abby Jarvis, and I'm part of the team over at QGive. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are an online fundraising platform for nonprofits. We've got a whole suite of fundraising tools that range from year-round donations to peer-to-peer events. We do text giving and some other really great fundraising strategies. We love learning with our friends in the nonprofit industry, and we are excited to have someone who is very active in the nonprofit industry with us today. Before we get started, there are just a couple of housekeeping things. We are recording the webinar, so we will send you a copy of this webinar after it is wrapped up. You'll probably get that in your inbox in the next couple of days. We are also live tweeting highlights of this presentation, and we would love it if you added your voice to that. If you want to follow along, we do have the Q webinar hashtag. We are also going to be fielding tons of questions from you guys. We will answer those in Q&A sessions that will be spaced throughout the presentation. If you've got any questions, just let us know by typing into the chat box that you see available there, and I will make sure that Kivi gets those questions. Kivi runs the Nonprofit Marketing Guide, which is a fantastic resource. She's got a ton of really awesome insights into the nonprofit communications trend survey that she just completed, and I hope you guys are as excited as I am today to talk to her. Kivi, I'm going to turn things over to you.
All right. Thanks, Abby. Let me get my screen sharing here properly. Yes, I know I'm screen sharing. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Abby said, I'm going to be talking about the results from our 2017 Nonprofit Communications Trends Report. This is a report that we've been producing, I think this is our 7th year at Nonprofit Marketing Guide. And we decided to shake things up a little bit this year and ask a whole bunch of brand new questions because frankly, the results weren't changing that much from year to year. The basics of nonprofit communications are pretty well established. So we really wanted to try to answer some of the other questions that we don't have real good data on, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Nonprofit Marketing Guide, we are really all about helping the staff at nonprofits that do the communications work. That means communications directors, coordinators, associates, those of you who have different job titles, but communications is a big part of your job. Our entire mission is to help you both learn your job and love your job, and we do that in a variety of different ways. So I encourage you to go to the website and check out some of what we have available for you. I'm going to stop, as Abby said, a couple of different times throughout the presentation today to answer your questions. So I'd really love for you to just fire in those questions now and as we go along. And like I said, Abby will stop and ask me those as we go along. We should have a little time at the end as well. And I do have a question for you, which I'm going to ask you to answer in your chat at the end, which is what's the biggest surprise or most interesting finding in what I share to you? I'm sort of buried in all of this information now and losing a little bit of perspective on what's most interesting. And so I would love to hear your perspective on what you find surprising or interesting. So just keep that in mind, and I'll ask you again at the end of the webinar. Okay, so what is this based on? Who says? We had over 1,100 participants in the survey this year. We usually have between 1,000 and 1,500. And 683 of those people were either communications directors or combination communications and development professionals. We asked some of those people some very specific additional questions. The vast majority of participants are from the U.S., about 7% from Canada, and then we have a few replies from dozens of different countries around the world. The survey is very representative of the sector as a whole, so we have lots of people from all the different mission areas and also a really good diversity in terms of organization size. And by the way, I am going to send the full report to all of you later on, either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So if there's anything that you see on the screen that I'm going too fast, don't worry, we'll send you the full report. And all of these slides are based on the report. So everything is in there too. So let's start out with the communications team size, budgets, and salaries. This is a question I get all the time. Just how big should our communications team be? What should the budget be? Am I being paid appropriately? And we just had a lot of anecdotal information, but now we actually have really good data. So I can tell you a few things. Let's start with team size. On average, nonprofits are employing one full-time communication staff person for every 8 employees overall. And while that's the average, it's actually not the most helpful number. What's more important to realize is that the smaller you are, the larger the percentage of staff that should be devoted to your communications work. In part, that's because there's a certain baseline of good communications that needs to happen regardless of how big you are. But at some point, that sort of maxes out, like you could get it covered. And so you may have a really huge, tremendous program staff, and you don't need that many more communications people to support them at some point. So let's look at this chart, and I'll explain all these numbers to you. So the blue dotted line you see is the percentage of total staff. And so if you look to the left of the chart, with smaller organizations, you tend to see a higher percentage of the total staff on the comms, and that decreases over time. The red line is your total communications FTE. So in small organizations, you might start out with a half a person or 1 person, and then you start to grow. And it really isn't until we get into the larger organizations that have over a $5 million budget that we really see the team start to get bigger than 3 people. And then with the very large nonprofits, it really sort of goes through the roof. So keep that in mind. Your total percentage is going to be higher for smaller organizations typically, but that's going to go down over time, and then your FTE is going to grow. What is the right size for a communications team? Of course, this is going to vary for everyone, but there are some general guidelines that we were able to pull from the data. We looked at communications effectiveness in a couple of different ways, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that shortly, but just bear with me for a moment. 3 FTE is sort of the sweet spot. It's the magic number where we see the maturity of teams and their effectiveness really growing pretty quickly and sort of hitting a really nice max point at about 3 FTE. And then it sort of levels off a little bit. Now that doesn't mean that you don't need 4 or 5 or 10 people on your communications team. It just means that you're not going to get that same sort of steep incline on effectiveness that you get when you're moving from 1 person to 2 people or 2 people to 3 people. So if you are working in a really small team and you feel overworked, it's not you. It's probably the fact that you need a larger team. And again, we found 3 people to be kind of the magic number within the survey data. Of course, again, the team size shifts by the overall budget of the nonprofit, so we've got more specific data here for you in the trends report if you really want to see the actual percentages and how those change. This is really the data behind the 2 lines I showed you earlier. Let's talk a little bit about budget. Budget numbers are much harder to talk about, in part because everyone sort of treats different communications figures differently. Like, is your website expense, hosting expense, is that a communications expense? Is it a technology expense? Where is that line item? Everyone does it really differently. So it's hard to really pin down a specific number. But what we ask people to do is to think about external communications expenses. So not salaries, but anything that you would pay someone outside your organization for. So things like advertising, freelancers, your web hosting, your email marketing, all of that stuff. We ask people to give us an estimate in some ranges. And we also included 2 other answers. 1, we don't spend anything besides salaries. And 2, we don't have a budget, but we can usually find the money when we need it. And 19% of the participants said that was the case in their organizations. They didn't actually have a budget, but they knew they were able to get money when they really needed it. 74% of nonprofits do have a specific budget for communications. And in the chart, you can see sort of how that plays out. Obviously, the bigger your organization is overall, the more likely you are to have a larger communications budget. We didn't really see it getting above 20,000 until we hit the 1 million mark for the overall budget size. I think that is it. Nope, I've got my salary data. Forgot about that. But I'm going to be happy to, I'm going to pause and take your questions on things like team size, budget, and salary here in just a second if there are any questions there. So communication salary. Last year was the first year that we asked this question. So we do have 2015 and 2016 data here. And we're just asking this of the communications staff in the survey. So you have communications director, manager, communications coordinator, assistant, and then a number of people gave us some feedback that they didn't like that we only made them pick communications versus development because they were a combination. So for the first year, we've also put that as a separate job category. So if you're responsible for both communications and development, then we've got that data information for you there as well on salary. We also got some important feedback about looking at that salary in a couple of different ways. So once again, we've broken it out by the size of your organization. And you can see if you're a communications director that's working for a relatively small organization, this $30,000 number, let me get my little highlighter pen here. You know, you're going to be more likely to be making 30 as a communications director in a really small organization. Whereas if you're, getting up into organizations in the millions, you're going to be making twice that. So that's an important consideration as well. And then again, we asked specifically the combo communications and development folks for their salary data as well. As I said, we got some feedback last year about, well, this isn't that helpful because I live in New York City or I live in Omaha, and what does that mean in terms of cost of living? So we attempted to answer that question this year by providing a couple of different categories, and we listed some sample cities in each of these different categories to give people sort of a general idea of what we were talking about. So places like New York City and San Francisco were in the very high category, and then it sort of went on down. And you can see there are significant differences again. So communications director that is in what we would call an affordable place. So this would be more like most rural areas or small cities in pretty affordable places of the country would be making $45,000, whereas if you're in a place like New York City or San Francisco, you're going to be closer to $82,000. All right, any questions so far, Abby? That's the data that we wanted to share on team size and budget and salaries.
Well, it looks like your data is pretty clear because we don't have any questions so far.
Okay, just keep firing them in, and we'll get to them as we go. All right, let's talk about communications goals by mission. And again, this is one of those things I found really fascinating, but I'm not sure how fascinating it is to everyone else, so you guys can tell me. But lots of times when we talk about the nonprofit sector and who should be doing what in terms of communications, there can be some really kind of weird arguments about that. And when we dig a little deeper into why we're arguing, it's often one of two things. Either there's a real focus on fundraising as a communications goal versus not, or it's really different for different kinds of organizations. And so this year we really tried to break that apart and to figure out, okay, who's doing what and how does that affect all the rest of the work? So this is the real why behind communications. And we asked about 12 different goals, and we used 10 different mission categories. And so what I'm going to do now is show you how that all sort of breaks out. So we're going to start with what I call the community engagement and education goals. So these are engaging our community, raising awareness of issues, and advocating on issues. And across the bottom, you can see the 10 different mission categories that we include in the report. So if you look at this, you can see this dark blue line. Engaging our community is fairly flat. You've got a few ups and downs, but it's fairly flat and it's fairly high. So what this is saying is somewhere between 60 and 70% of all these different nonprofits are saying that engaging our community is a very high or essential communications priority for the organization. You can see that raising awareness of issues, which is the blue dotted line, it really depends on your mission. So organizations that are public benefit research or advocacy organizations, 70% of them say that's a really high priority. Whereas if you look at religion, it's pretty low. Okay, and philanthropy, raising awareness of issues, not a super high priority, or it's only a high priority for half of the organizations. If you look at advocacy, again, you have a line, this is the advocacy line, that's really up and down. Advocacy is important to a lot of different kinds of organizations. It's not as important to arts, culture, and humanities. Take a look at some of the other goals. So these are the brand and leadership goals. So brand and reputation management, again, overall, it's a pretty big priority for nonprofits. This line is at the top of the chart compared to a lot of other lines. But you can see it sort of declines for different types of organizations. Religious organizations, they don't worry so much about their brand because their brand is how they think about God. So they don't have as many brand issues per se, although there are certainly exceptions to that. Thought leadership, you see it's really not that important to certain organizations, and it's very important to others. Again, there's a real up and down here. Again, it's really interesting that all arts, culture, and humanities really tries to stay out of thought leadership and out of issue advocacy. I was a little surprised to see the number quite that low, frankly. But this gives you a much different perspective on who's doing what in the communications world, and making sure that you understand these differences is important. If you're, for example, a consultant working in the sector, you really need to understand who cares about what in terms of their communications. Let's look at program recruitment goals. So recruiting or engaging participants is the dark blue line. Volunteers is the lighter blue line. And recruiting and serving members is the hashed purple line. So again, you can see who is this most important for? Well, associations, membership, okay? Arts and culture, recruiting participants, trying to get people in the door to actually participate, come to the museum, that sort of thing. Very high rankings for over 70% of those kinds of organizations. You look at the other end, and there are organizations that don't need to really recruit people. The people either naturally show up or it's just not the kind of work they do. So again, it's important to keep that in mind. Education is pretty high. You're trying to recruit or engage people to attend your school, for example. And last but not least, we have fundraising. And again, this is really interesting because there are so many ups and downs. Major donors is the hashed line here, and you can see it's relatively straight. I mean, there's some ups and downs, but it's pretty clearly within 50 to 60%, except where we have this drop-off. Associations don't tend to do major donor fundraising. Small and medium gifts from individuals. Again, it's fairly clear that it's in here, but then we have a drop-off, right? Foundations don't need to do a lot of fundraising from small and medium individuals. They're more interested in the major donors. So for foundations, you can really see the difference here between major donors and small to medium. Fundraising events is, I think, also really interesting because we're going to see that events plays a big part in the workload of different communications and development professionals in a minute. And so it's important to see who does events and who doesn't. So international organizations, pretty low on events. Religion, pretty low on events. And if you think about it, that makes sense. I go to a Christian church, and every Sunday about 45 minutes into the service is a fundraising event when they pass the plate. So we don't have to do a lot of additional fundraising events. But other organizations like health, disease, medical research, here we have arts, culture, and humanities, much more important to do event fundraising for those kinds of organizations. So any questions about goals before we move on to the next section?
We do have a couple. One of them is actually about a previous section. Raquel asked if you could give any insight into the job descriptions that you referenced in the salary section.
Sure. So, we didn't really provide a job description because the job is pretty varied. But what we tried to do is to indicate more of a senior level versus junior level. And so we said communications director or manager as one category versus communications assistant or coordinator. And I know that there are coordinators who are the only people and are doing all the work, but we are trying to use those job titles as a way to indicate junior versus senior, and you see that in the salary differential. With the combo, what we're saying is we're trying to recognize that a number of people are responsible for both the communications work and the development work. They don't have a separate development director and a separate communications director. Those do tend to be the smaller organizations that are making it all one person's job. And because that is pretty prevalent, we wanted to recognize that.
Sure. Okay. Raquel, I hope that is helpful. And the next one is from Anna. And in one of your slides, you referenced thought leadership as a goal. Can you define a little bit what thought leadership means in that context?
Sure. So I can't remember exactly how we phrased it in the report, but the idea is that you are trying to be leading the way that your part of the sector talks about issues. And so, you're the person whose blog people read. You're the person who gets called by the media. You're the person that gets called to testify in front of your legislature. You're the person that gets asked to speak at the conferences in your sector. It's that idea that people are really looking to you to determine what's next and what's cutting edge and what's most appropriate in your world.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for clarifying that, Anna. I hope that helps. And those are the two questions we had for this section.
Okay, well, I will continue on then. So
Awesome.
We're going to now look at how communications staff are actually spending their time. And I keep threatening to do a time survey where I actually have people volunteer to track their time down to the 15 minutes. And I think we'll eventually get around to doing that. But for now, we're just asking people to generally categorize, is it a limited amount of time, a moderate amount of time, an excessive amount of time, how much time relatively are you spending on different things? So we started out with the major communications channels. From all of our previous research, we know that these 6 elements along the bottom here are what we call the big 6 communications channels for nonprofit. And they are generally in order of importance from our previous surveys: website, blog, email, social media, print, media relations, PR, and in-person events. And so we asked people to tell us, relatively speaking, how much time you're spending managing each of these channels. And you can see this one is broken down by job title. So the dark blue line are the communication staff, the purple line are the development fundraising staff, and the blue hash line are the people that have that combo job. And as you can see, it's really pretty flat, both of these lines for the first 4. So for website, email, social, and print, pretty much the same amount of time is equally split on those channels. And then for communications directors, the amount of time spent sort of plummets. So you have this dive down on to media relations, and then you have a much smaller amount, a limited amount of time on in-person events. Let's shift to development staff. That's the purple line, and you can see it's quite different. Development staff spend very little time on the website, social media, or media relations, like practically none on media relations. Where are they spending all their time? Email, print, and in-person events. And of course, this shouldn't be a surprise because that's where you ask for money, is email, print, and in-person events. Now, what's interesting is that those of you that have the combo job, so how do you go from being in between the dark blue line and being in between the purple line? Well, it pretty much averages out. What we see is that the combined staff end up doing they're still managing all these channels. They're just spending a little less time on all of them so that they have more time for events. That's really what's happening here, is just dialing back the amount of time that a full-time communications person can spend on those things to make room for the events, which often need to happen if you're in charge of development. When we look at the actual activities as opposed to just the channels, the shape is pretty consistent. So we asked about writing and editing, graphic design, photography, video, editorial planning, internal and external meetings, and managing your email inbox. And again, communications staff tend to spend more time on all of these things until we get to the meetings. And you can see there's sort of this cross point here in the map where things start to come together, and then what's on top shifts. So the development directors are spending more time externally than the communications directors. And again, if you think about it, that makes sense because they're probably out doing donor meetings. Everybody is struggling with their email. If you look at what I would consider productive time on writing and editing, creating communications, it's just about the same as we spend managing email, which is an unfortunate but true reality for us. So to summarize, what does your job look like if you're a communications director? You are truly multi-channel managers. You're spending a lot of time working on a lot of different communications channels, but that time is pretty evenly split between website, email, social, and print. You spend a little less time on media and even less on events. And you spend more time overall managing these 6 channels than staff in other positions. If you're a combo communications and development staff person, then your job is really a hybrid of 2 people's jobs. And as I said, we most often see these folks in smaller organizations. And this is anecdotal, but they tend to be much more unhappy in the job and much more stressed out because you really have too many goals usually. Like I said, you're spending your time almost evenly across channels, much like the communication staff, but you're not spending as much time. So you're skimming time off of all of those channels, which allows the combo communications people to do more of the event work like the development staff. Development staff spend little to no time at all managing the social media, website, or media relations for an organization. And the major exception here is events, where they're, again, spending way more time compared to the communication staff. So if you're having arguments within your organization about the relative importance of a communications channel, arguing about things like events or social media, it's good to keep this in mind and to think about who's being asked to do what and how that relates back to those goals we just talked about. Because if you're doing fundraising, you're going to have a very different perspective than if individual fundraising is not important to you and you're really trying to work on some of those other goals. So it's good to have this information just to be able to set up the conversations within your own organization and to start those in a sort of more intelligent way than just arguing about who's right and who's wrong. Any questions so far, or should I just keep rolling, Allie?
Well, I did get one question. I got one from Norman who asked, at what point do you think the communication and development functions should be split?
Hi, Norman. It's a good question, and I think it depends on the extent to which the organization is trying to do individual fundraising, because that's very time-consuming as opposed to an organization that maybe is well-funded with foundation work, and you're just trying to do a little bit of individual fundraising on the side. If you really need a full-time communications director and a full-time development director, you're never going to be able to maximize the results on either one of those without splitting the job. So it really sort of depends. I know that's a terrible answer, but It
Well,
depends.
thank you for answering it. And Norm, I hope that helps you out. Those are all the
right.
questions we have for this section.
Okay. So let's talk about communications effectiveness. If you work in development full time, you have this very easy measure, right? Which is like how much money you raised and how quickly you did it. And of course, there are lots of other metrics that fall from that. But the bottom line is the bottom line. For communications coordinators, directors, it's not as clear cut. Again, I showed you 12 different goals, only 3 of which were related directly to fundraising. So trying to figure out an effective way to measure communications effectiveness is one of the challenges that we've been taking on at Nonprofit Marketing Guide. So we did this in a lot of different ways within the survey. And so I'm going to share some of those with you. Some of them we were pretty clear about what we were doing, and in other cases we sort of hid the questions in the survey because I didn't want it to seem obvious that I was asking you to rate yourself. But you'll see how it all sort of fits together here. The way that I'm defining effectiveness is the ability to produce a desired result. And there are 2 important elements of this. The first is the desired result. And so again, that goes back to the dozen different goals that we asked people about. The other part is your ability to produce it. And there's a lot that comes into play there, right? So you have, are you adequately staffed? Do you have the budget? Are your skills up to speed? Do you have management support? Are you able to actually get any work done in your open office floor plan? You know, there are a lot of different elements that go into this, and so we tried to attack it from all of those different elements. So we asked participants to get at this in a couple of different ways. We said, tell us what your overall communications effectiveness was on a scale of 1 to 5. Just overall, tell us how you think you're doing. And then we asked a series of questions that we use, we called our marketing maturity scale. I did not identify this really as a 10-point quiz within the survey, although that's basically what it was. And these are 10 questions that we pulled from a larger set of 35 questions that we use with our clients and people that participate in our Communications Director Mentoring Program. Then we asked people whether they were doing better or worse on a series of challenges that we know are very common from our previous years of doing this survey when we asked people what's hard about the work, what's easy about the work. We know what the challenges are. And so instead of continuing to ask what the challenges are, instead we're shifting to asking how well you're doing on managing those challenges. And then finally we asked communication staff for their personal level of confidence in their job skills and also their overall job satisfaction. Now, some people would argue that this last bullet has nothing to do with communications effectiveness, like you can be miserable in the job and still get it done well. And I would beg to differ because we're working in the nonprofit sector. People are generally not as well paid as they should be. Benefits are not as good as they should be. And your satisfaction determines whether you're going to stay in the job or not. And staying in the job determines your level of expertise and your ability to be strategic long term. And so I would argue that job satisfaction is actually really important to overall communications effectiveness for your organization long term. You don't want to have a revolving door, and we've seen, particularly with development directors who have a revolving door and very low job satisfaction, pretty serious impact on fundraising. And we don't want to see that in the nonprofit world. So that's why I'm pretty adamant about including that measure as well. Okay, so let's break each of these down. So overall effectiveness, again, it was a simple 5-star scale. Tell us how effective you think you were in 2016. On average, overall, across everybody that answered, 3.3 stars, somewhere between somewhat and very effective. When we look at who ranked themselves higher, who gave themselves 4 to 5 stars, we see a couple of interesting trends. Nonprofits that had staffing or budget improvement in 2016, organizations that are larger, over $1 million, nonprofits working in environment and animals in particular, and then 2 different kinds of communications teams, and I'm going to talk more about this toward the end, but integrated teams and centralized teams. who ranked themselves lower than average, only 1 to 2 stars. No big shocker here, nonprofits who saw their budgets cut in 2016. Nonprofits who are either really small or really big. There's a point at which you get so big that you actually start to get the same level of unhappiness and ineffectiveness as when you're too small. Religious organizations and health, disease, and medical research tend to rank themselves lower. And then the CEO-led and tactical internal agency teams. And again, I'm going to explain those different types of teams here in just a minute. So that was the first scale, the 3.3 out of 5 stars. But we wanted to also do a scale that was a little more quantitative, I guess, in a way. So we have a more detailed ranking, 1 through 7, on a series of much more specific indicators or best practices. So we gave people this scale, and this is generally how we lump them together. So if you're doing a 1, 2, or 3, you're in what we call the knowledge zone. You understand that this best practice exists, but you're not doing it. If you're in the 4 or 5 zone, it means you're proficient. You're actually trying to implement the best practice. And then if you're at the 6 and 7, you're an expert or a master at that best practice. So here are 5 of the 10. These are the sorts of things that we use, again, to really determine whether someone is implementing the best practices that lead to effectiveness. So it's things like defining a target audience, being able to segment your communications to those people, writing content that is centered on the recipient, using a consistent brand, consistent voice, style, and tone, regularly incorporating visual content. So you can see how these scores came out. And people are saying, yeah, we're doing that, but then they're not quite actually doing it in terms of segmenting. This, I think, was the highest score out of the 10, doing the visual content. People are feeling pretty good about that. The other 5 questions were using an editorial calendar, building content curation and repurposing into your process, using a content management system for your website, using a CRM to track your database, and then establishing measures. Again, I have a larger set of 35 questions that we use with clients and people in our mentoring program, but I tried to boil it down to the 10 that I thought were good indicators. And to match that up with how people did the self-ranking on the effectiveness. And it matched up pretty well. So organizations that had given themselves only 1 or 2 stars on the effectiveness rating ranked the lowest in the maturity with a 28 score. So that's kind of between aware and ready. The overall average was a 39, which is at the top of the knowledge zone right before being proficient and really ready to implement. Organizations that ranked themselves as 4-star were more in that proficiency zone. And then the 5-star organizations were right at the skilled level. Very few, well, I'll take that back. A number of organizations did rank themselves in the mastery zone on 1 or 2 points. Very few organizations sort of consistently rank themselves in this mastery zone. And I think that's in part because this job is still relatively new and things are changing so quickly. So, anyone that says that they're a master at social media or a master at this or a master of that who works at a nonprofit, I tend to question whether they know what they're talking about because it just changes so fast. It's hard for anybody to truly master or be an authority on much of anything. Like you have to be able to really specialize and not have to manage 6 channels. If you were having to manage 6 channels, I don't really see how you could call yourself an authority on any one of those channels. And I think the data really reflects that in the sector. Couple more slides on this, I believe. So how does this match the team size? If you have 0 staff time dedicated to communications, what that says, based on this data, is that you may understand that these best practices exist, but there is absolutely no ability to implement them. Only when we start to see staff grow do we start to see the marketing maturity increase. So this is, this 26 is basically, yeah, I heard of that, but we don't do it. And then the maturity increases pretty steadily until about that 3 FTE mark. And then it still will continue to grow, but it's just going to be a much slower rate of growth. So again, 3 is kind of a magic team number for communications work. And again, the effectiveness rating and the maturity score lined up pretty well in terms of how that changes over time or across organizations. And what's really, I think, interesting is that there were no significant differences between nonprofits with different missions. So it doesn't really matter what your goals were and what your organization does. It's really more about things like your team size and the skill level of individuals and your ability to manage some of those challenges. Questions now, Allie, or should I keep going?
We don't have any questions right now, so I think we're good to go on.
Okay, let's talk about managing those daily challenges. As I said from our previous surveys, we know what's painful for everybody doing this work. So what we decided to do was to sort of say, well, okay, we know this is a pain point. Let's talk about whether it's getting worse or better. So collaboration within the team, collaboration with fundraising staff, collaboration with program staff. Most nonprofits said this was getting better. So I think that's great news. This is really about understanding who's doing what, talking to each other within the office, and really trying to share each other's goals. You may have individual goals that are pretty different, but they should all be kind of feeding up into these larger goals. So that was good news. We also had some great news about people doing editorial planning and the value of that. That is something that we talk a lot about at Nonprofit Marketing Guide because it really is the single most important tool to getting a grip on this work. If you are feeling just completely frazzled and like you're in a state of chaos all the time, odds are you're probably not doing editorial planning or you're not doing it in a way that's helping you. So we found that nonprofits with effective communication, so those are the 4- and 5-star organizations, are 3 times as likely to use an editorial calendar. And those same organizations, the 4- and 5-star organizations, are twice as likely to invest significant amounts of time into editorial planning compared to the effective ones. So we know it works, and we have the data to prove it now. More good news. Relationships with executive directors are getting stronger. Again, when I say effective organizations, I'm talking about the people that rank themselves as a 4 or 5. 52% of those report exceptional working relationships with their ED, with only 4% calling that difficult. The rest of them said it was functional, good and functional, but not exceptional. When we look at the ineffective teams, only 17% said it was an exceptional relationship, and 30% said that it was difficult. So this relationship with executives is really important. And from this research and some research we did last year, we know that there's a big difference not only between the difficult relationship and the exceptional relationship, but between the functional relationship, which is kind of that middle zone, and the exceptional relationship. It really is important to try to get to that really strong working partnership with your ED. It makes a huge difference in your communications effectiveness. A little more good news, clarity about responsibilities and procedures, the ability to experiment, those improved for about 1/3 of nonprofits, and about half said it stayed the same. So overwhelming majority are either at the same place or getting better. Now, where's the bad news? Communication staffing and budgets are getting worse given the workload. And we phrase that like that on purpose. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you had a staff cut or a budget cut. What it more likely means is that you got more work thrown at you without getting more staff or budget to deal with it. So that given the workload is a really important qualifier on this question. More nonprofits said their staffing and budget levels got worse in 2016 than those that said it got better. And it was about the same for half of nonprofits. This is the worst news that came out of the daily challenges section. We asked about your ability to focus on work, the extent to which urgent tasks are overtaking important ones, your ability to limit interruptions in your day so that you can actually focus on your work, and over 40% of nonprofits said that these things had gotten worse. And we had very few nonprofits who said that any of these got better. So this is a real challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. It's something that's hard. It's a hard nut to crack for a lot of different reasons. Part of it is the nature of communications work. You are managing so many different channels. Those of you that need to be responsive to what's happening in the media, boy, you had your work cut out for you before our current president, and now you really do, having the first president that is openly tweeting all the time. So there's a lot going on, and that isn't going to change. What you need to really figure out is how you survive within that chaos. So some ways to improve your day-to-day effectiveness. What we did is I looked at the organizations that were most effective and that showed improvement on these, and I compared them to the ineffective organizations that said all this stuff got worse. And I tried to see, okay, where are the biggest differences? And there were 6 elements that really stood out the most, and I have them in order for you. So increasing collaboration between communications and fundraising staff, improving the clarity about who's doing what and who gets to decide what related to the communications work, ensuring that strategic thinking is really driving the work. So it's not just let's do everything in the kitchen sink, or there's this hot new thing, why aren't we doing it? Not thinking like that, but being very strategic. Increasing the collaboration between communications and program staff. Building that management trust in the expertise of the communication staff. And then clarifying the processes and procedures for how the work actually gets done. So you can see a lot of this is about relationship building, but it's also things that you can control as a communications director. You can work on those relationships. You can work on putting things like the process, the procedure, who's reviewing what the editorial calendar looks like, when we're talking about different communications channels. Those are all things that you can start to manage on your own as a communications director. Okay, and then we had, like I said, our final question was about confidence and job satisfaction. So we saw confidence in skills rise slightly, and we saw job satisfaction go down a bit. Going to talk about the team models. Allie, you want to stop me if we have any questions? Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
I think you're good to keep going.
Okay. So from my consulting work over the past 15 years or so, I've seen a number of different models that nonprofits are using. But I didn't have any data to really support sort of how popular any particular model was. So I did some initial research just to verify that, yeah, these 4 models are actually common. And then we surveyed on it. And we found something really interesting, which is that 75% of nonprofits are using one of these 4 models to determine how their communications workload is created. And again, I didn't say, tell me what your org chart looks like. What I did is said, tell me what the team looks like based on how the workload for the team is created. Who's basically creating the to-do list for the communications team? How is that happening? And the interesting thing was that the distribution of these 4 models across the sector is really balanced. Like, it doesn't really matter what your mission is. It doesn't really matter how big your organization is. These are pretty widespread across all those organizations. And these 4 teams are pretty equally spread across the sector. So, 20%, 18%, 18%, 19%. That's pretty even distribution. So let me explain a little bit about each team. In an integrated team, so we'll start over here. The integrated teams, this is where the communications and the development staff are working together to jointly make decisions about communications within the organization. That is contrasted with the centralized team, where the communications staff are really directing the communication strategy, getting input from across the organization, but then sort of taking charge of that and promoting it that way. So these two are both ranking pretty highly in terms of effectiveness and marketing maturity. The difference is really related to individual fundraising. So if you're going to prioritize small and medium donors and major donors and events, you're going to be better off with an integrated team. It's definitely the most collaborative model. And again, it's great for organizations that are raising money from individuals. Now, if you don't raise a lot of money from individuals, so most of your money is coming from grants, fees, or major donors, then you may want to go with more of a centralized approach. This can also work well where you have a lot of other marketing-related goals. Remember the 12 different goals I showed you? If a lot of those are really important, or not a lot of them, but if you have some that are really important to the success of your organization, more so than development or just as much as development goals, you may want to do more of a separate but equal model. So you would have a communications department and you would have a fundraising department, and they would coordinate and have a close partnership, but they're not going to be on the same team. It's not going to be as fully integrated. These are the two most successful models. They're different, but they both work. Now, there are 2 other models that are just as present in the sector, but their effectiveness is significantly lower. So we have what we call the internal agency team. These are people who are specialists who do the work. They don't drive the strategy. So they tend to be very responsive to other people, coming in and saying, I need you to make this thing. And then you make the thing, and then whoever asked you to make the thing takes it and leaves, and you don't ever know what happened to the thing. You just made it. So again, it's really skilled writers and designers and web development people, but they're typically not involved in strategy. They may be the brand manager, so they may be the person that says it has to look this way to fit the style guide. But generally speaking, they tend to be more of a content mill for other departments. When we also look at smaller organizations and understaffed teams, we tend to see what we call the CEO-led team. And so this is an executive director that's giving direction to the communications staff. And this ends up being the least effective, least mature model, least confident in skills, not as strategic, most scattered. Communications people in this model tend to be pretty unhappy, and it doesn't really work that well. And it's probably because it's just a smaller organization that's understaffed. There are larger organizations that have not grown their communications team, and they would fall into this category too. And those are organizations where there was probably someone on the line who looked and said, wow, we're a $5 million organization and I'm the only communications person. That is wrong. And you're right, it is wrong. You should have more like 3 people at that point, if not more. So a bunch of you are sort of stuck in this model. Now, this doesn't mean that these can't work. It just means that your odds of it working are much lower. You have to do a lot of additional collaboration and communication, and you have to be extremely strategic to make these work. It's much easier to make these two, the integrated and centralized teams, work. So here's some of the data that supports these conclusions I just gave you. Again, ranking themselves as very effective, 42% and 50% versus 28 and 24. You can see the marketing maturity is a little bit less. on the right. Saw improvements in being strategic, which again we know is a big problem. Only a quarter found that to be the case in internal agency and CEO-led. Capable and confident skills is pretty equal across the board, except for the CEO-led where it's only a third. May have a executive director second guessing their communications people. That might be one of the reasons why that is lower. Job satisfaction, again, much higher on this side, and dissatisfaction, much higher on this side of the chart. All right, so that brings me to the close of presenting the data. Now I would like to ask you a question, which is what was most surprising or interesting to you? Remember at the top of the webinar I said I was going to ask you this question. So if you can go ahead and fire in your answer to that, we'll have Abby read some of those out for us. And after you're done typing in your biggest surprise or most interesting finding, feel free to go ahead and send in additional questions too. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, so we can do a little speed round if we get a lot of questions.
We do have one question from Anna who she brought up a concept called holacracy. Are you familiar with the term?
Is this like the really flat organization?
Yes. When I Googled it, it looks like it is something like Zappos, where at Zappos, customer service people and social media workers are empowered individually to work on things as they see fit. And they have team leaders, but they don't really have to go to CEO or someone like that. And Anna was curious about your perception of the holacracy idea and maybe how it would work in the nonprofit world.
For something like that I think it would be great for starters, but there are a couple of things that are required that, frankly, I don't see in the sector very often. And that would be really strong strategic leadership on communications. We just don't see it that often. And of course, there are exceptions, but I'm talking about the majority of organizations do not have an executive director who is extremely well-versed in communications or fundraising best practices. And, I'm not trying to be judgmental about that. It's just a fact. A lot of EDs are coming up through the ranks, through the program side, and so they know a lot about the mission of the organization, implementing the mission, which is fabulous, but they don't have a lot of background on communications and development. And so I think for that approach to work, you do need an executive that is dedicated to really understanding those best practices and really building up that kind of trust with their staff. And again, our research has shown this year and last year that when you have that kind of management trust in your staff, you can do pretty amazing things. And so I think it's possible, but it really depends on having an executive team that's prepared to lead that kind of organization.
That makes a lot of sense, especially since it seems like a major theme in communications is keeping your tone and your message on point, and that might be complicated with a holacracy model.
I think it depends. Like some organizations, like a lot of social service agencies run literally 30 or 40 programs, and it's not an exaggeration. I mean, they just run a lot of different service programs, especially if you serve really old people and really young people. So, I think it's harder in those kinds of organizations. If you're very single-driven, you only do one thing and you do it really well, I think it's a little easier.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. We are getting some pretty great responses to your question about the biggest surprises or most interesting findings. I see Mary Weaver said that her biggest surprise was that salaries are actually competitive. So I think it's encouraging for people to see kind of the industry averages so they can gauge how things are going for them. Marianne Downing said that the difference between the 4 models of communications and effectiveness was the most surprising and enlightening for her. And Raquel Nunez pitched in and said that she was surprised to hear how common it is for communication and development to overlap. She kind of thought that she was stuck in her own silo, but there is a lot of overlap there.
Yeah.
Janet chimed in and said that media relations seemed to be a small amount of time spent on the job, and then she wondered if that meant that nonprofits just don't have time to respond to press inquiries, or if as nonprofits they're not able to be in the press as much as they would like to be, which is a very interesting point.
Yeah, I think on that one, I'll just respond to that media. I think it is a matter of not being able to focus on it in a lot of cases. And the other thing to keep in mind is that media relations is a totally different job than it was pre-internet and pre-downsizing of major media channels and sort of the proliferation of specialized niche news. So it's just a completely different job than it used to be, and I think people are still trying to grapple with that exactly.
Sure. I think people in the media are still grappling with that.
Yes, absolutely.
It sounds like a lot of people who are listening to you run through this data are reassured by what you're finding. Ashley Bannon said that it was very interesting to her to identify where her nonprofit sits in relation to these findings. She said, "I knew I had some work to do, but this showed me I'm not alone with my problems, such as having trouble prioritizing with so many competing urgent tasks." And then Norman came back and said that he always thought that development and fundraising worked well together, and that it's nice to see the data to support that. So it sounds like this is an affirming presentation for a lot of people who are listening.
Yeah, and we find that all the time at Nonprofit Marketing Guide. So if you are one of those people who feels like you're sort of out alone in the desert, come inside. Come to Nonprofit Marketing Guide. We have tons of free resources. We have some paid programming too, and we're here for you, and you are not alone in this. So come find your people. We're here, and we exist for you.
One thing that you have on your website that I find fascinating is the series you did a while ago on having nonprofit communicators actually come in and talk to you about what their day-to-day looks like. And I think pieces like that can also be as affirming as this data is.
Yeah, so we do a series on the blog called A Day in the Life, and it's just a Google form that anyone can fill out. So if you go to nonprofitmarketingguide.com/blog, we publish them usually on Mondays, so if you just sort of skip through a couple of weeks, it's not every Monday, but you'll be able to find them, and then there's always a link in there. And you can just go fill out a Google form. We ask you what you do before 8 a.m., from 8 to 10, 10 to 12, et cetera. And then we publish that as you write it. And so again, like you said, it's a really good way to sort of understand that, wow, my crazy day is not that unusual.
Absolutely. Everybody, that kind of wraps it up for us. If you have any questions for me or for Kivi, please let us know. If you ask me those questions in the chat box, I'll leave it live for a little while longer. I can send those along. You really aren't alone as a nonprofit communicator. Kivi's blog is a wonderful resource for you. I hope you check it out and find something that you love that will help make your job easier. And I know just from talking to you and from reading Kivi's blog that you've taken time out of your very busy schedule to attend this webinar, and we really appreciate that you took time out of your day to join us. As I said at the beginning of this webinar, we did record this webinar, and I am going to email it to you. You will also get a copy of this report that Kivi put together, so you will be able to review this at your leisure, share it with people at your nonprofit, and make sure that you start working on collaboration as so many of the nonprofits referenced in the report did. Keep an eye on your inbox. We also are going to send you an invitation to our subsequent webinars, which are going to be super cool also. And I hope that this conversation continues past this webinar. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and continuing to work with Kivi and other nonprofit communicators. With that, I am going to say goodbye and stop recording. Please feel free to email us if you have any more questions.